South African mining companies are suffering from the country's ongoing electricity crisis. Mining production suffered a 9% decline in November 2022. According to figures released by Statistics South Africa this week, this was the 10th consecutive month of decreased production. On a year-on-year basis, mining production fell by 4.5% after a drop of 6.4% in October. Stats SA says that the 14-day Transnet strike in October also had a negative impact on the sector, particularly iron ore. Platinum Group Metals production was hardest hit, with output declining 22%. Load shedding was a factor during the month for Platinum Group metal miners, but the decline was also a result of a 2-month delay in a smelter rebuild at one of the processing facilities of Anglo American Platinum, which it announced in September. The last time the industry experienced a consecutive decrease of this magnitude was between February 2020 and February 2021 at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Joining me now is economist Professor Roux. He is the head Futures Studies Programs and lead lecturer in economics at Stellenbosch University Business School. Thank you so much for joining me, Professor Roux. Welcome again to Business Edge.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much, and a very good year for everybody.
Thank you so much. So let's sort of build a picture of what the mining industry means, first of all, for South Africa. The mining industry is an important part of the South African economy, contributing around 480.9 billion rand to the country's GDP in 2021 and employing over 458,000 people in that same year. It was once considered a bedrock of the economy. Is that still the case, or do you think things have now changed?
Well, certainly over the longer term, things have changed. If we have a look at the contribution of mining to the country's gross value added, then back in the 60s and even the 70s, you're talking about 30-odd%. Today, it's barely 8%, where services, of course, have really taken over as the major contribution. But having said that, mining remains crucial, especially when we look at exports. Well over half, 60% plus of this country's exports, merchandise exports, emanates from the mining and to some extent the agricultural sector. And as you pointed out in the introduction, it does provide jobs for close to 500,000 people. Not as many as before, but what I normally say is it's no longer as important as in years gone by, but it certainly still remains a very important part of the South African economy.
Do you think we could get to a time where it becomes as important as it used to be? There are, of course, a lot of conversations around the future of mining anywhere around the continent. But in terms of how much it has given South Africa and how much it still has to give South Africa, could we see it sort of returning to the days of past glory?
No, I don't think so. I think, the term is often used that mining, and one generalizes awfully, is becoming almost a sunset industry. The old melody in many parts of Africa is that we tend to mine stuff and then export it in its raw form to countries elsewhere in the world, and they add value. That still holds true for many parts of the continent and indeed for South Africa. So no, I don't see it returning to those 20-30% contributions, but as I said, it does remain a crucial part of our export performance. Some might argue it's too significant in terms of exports, that we should be adding value ourselves and transforming our mined materials into something that consumers really want to buy overseas.
Okay, so let's look at the data that's come out now. So it's a 9% decline in November, and that might not sound like much to many people, as well as a year-on-year drop of 4.5%. So for this sector that, as we talked about, was once the bedrock of South Africa's economy, what does the 10th consecutive month of decreased production translate to in real terms? So beyond the numbers, what does this continuous trend of decline in production really mean?
Well, I think it's part of a slightly different story in the sense that it just confirms the fact that mining and the mining industry is subject to all kinds of forces, some external, some internal, which makes it very volatile. So in 2021, for instance, the mining industry did exceptionally well. The demand for minerals and other mined goods was high, prices were quite good, and the sector boomed. Only to be followed, as you just pointed out, obviously in 2022, by just the opposite. So it's again indicative of that typical, almost resource curse, as some might call it, where when the going is good, the economy or the sector and the economy by implication does exceptionally well, but then that can all turn around at the drop of a feather. And as you pointed out in production, we did see 2021 was a good year, last year far less so, and you pointed out some of the major reasons. Many of them are internal constraints. Many of them are of our own making, whether that be so-called load shedding, but not only load shedding. For a number of years, we've realized that in the mining industry, as in others as well, there are a number of basic constraints, ranging from transport constraints, but also labor costs. Bear in mind that if we think about gold mining, for instance, the quality of ore is deteriorating. You have to dig deeper and deeper and deeper. Some of our mine shafts are 5 kilometers below the Earth's surface. The cost of radio to get there, and then they say the quality is not all that great. So labor costs as well are obviously very high in South Africa. And we do know, and we see this regularly, that workers, unionized workers, demand exceptionally high wage increases which are not always in tandem with actual productivity. So, as I say, almost self-imposed constraints are playing a big role in our industry, in the mining industry, over and above international global trends.
So let's separate those two constraints, as you've mentioned. Let's first look at the load shedding aspect. I know there was a time when mining companies were even telling the governments that they want to produce their own electricity, then to be able to add back to the national grid, but that was never really appreciated. So they've been dependent on Eskom to a very large instance. In terms of the electricity challenges, what impact has Eskom's struggles and challenges had beyond what we're seeing in the mining industry?
If I understand you correctly, you're asking what challenges has Eskom had in the mining industry?
What challenges the mining industry has had because of Eskom?
Oh, okay. Well, as you're quite rightly pointing out, there are many potential independent power producers, the mines being one of them, which could feasibly produce a lot of electricity, perhaps not go off the grid, but certainly produce a lot and even sell it back to Eskom. That just simply hasn't happened, or not to the extent one would hope for. So the challenges to the mining industry, well, you can imagine with these days, in the last week or so, up to 12 hours per day of no electricity. Well, that's if that were to be annualized, that's half the potential production, which is compromised. And then the challenge goes beyond just the actual production activities on the mines, but also, as I mentioned earlier, transport. It has an impact on things such as the quality of water. We're getting very worried about the inability, because of load shedding, to purify water. It has challenges in terms of the simple ability of people to get to work or back again. So it goes beyond just the immediate obvious ones. But perhaps the biggest cost is the reputational cost. Of potential investors looking at our mining sector and saying, well, maybe we would consider investing in having a mining industry, but with all these costs, including load shedding, labor costs, etc., we can have second thoughts. So I think that reputational cost is, in the longer run, one of the more important ones, one of the more significant ones.
Very true. So now the second constraint you also mentioned was because the labor cost, but I want to look at it in terms of the strikes, because it wasn't just load shedding that negatively affected the mining sector. There have also been a number of strikes in the past 1 to 2 years that have gone on for several weeks and in some instances several months as well. So in terms of those strikes, do you think primarily the issues of the strikes have been addressed, or do we anticipate that South Africa, which has a reputation again for strikes, should be anticipating more in the mining industry this year? So as you talked about labor costs, we've seen the strikers ask for living wages, increases in salary to meet the rising inflation, of course, as well as rising standards of living that South Africa is facing. What do we anticipate for the industry this year?
I'm afraid I would anticipate more strikes. It's one of those double-edged swords. Obviously, the cost of living has risen tremendously, as it has in most parts of the world. And one has a great deal of sympathy for the demands or the request for higher wages. But it becomes, as I say, a double-edged sword, almost a vicious cycle, because if those demands are met, then the already high costs of mining become even higher, making it less attractive. There's always the possibility, in fact, we see evidence already here and elsewhere in the world, that the human factor, human beings, will be replaced to some extent by smart robots and even artificial intelligence. There are reports of new mine shafts being sunk by smart robots and being designed to be used in the future only by smart robots, thereby obviating the need for human beings. So it's a very messy, all kinds of moving parts. But your question was strikes in the mining sector over the next few months. I'm pretty sure it'll happen, yes.
All right, so Professor Roux, let me also ask about the boom. So with Russia, Ukraine, 2022, there was a bit of a commodities boom, and we saw South Africa being able to take advantage of that. But this is still a very volatile industry, and I know that many people don't want to anticipate that possible boom. So when we look at the figures already, it was November we've seen, we're still going to wait for December. If we follow that trend, one, do you think the trend of decline in production will either stabilize or continue further to decline? And when you look at that commodities boom from 2022, can South Africa expect to take even a very small advantage of that boom, even in the first maybe 1 or 2 quarters of this year?
Yeah, you see, that's one of the almost sad things, that technically we should have done much better last year because of that boom. We weren't able to exploit, in the nicest sense of the word, that global boom. Looking forward, I suspect that boom, the commodity boom, might have already come to an end. You know, bear in mind, as we all know, partly because of the Russian-Ukraine thing, but even without that, we had seen inflation rates rising all over the world. And the reaction to that has been obviously higher interest rates. And as we all know, the jury's still out, but there is still a strong voice that suggests the world might be going into a recession this year, or certainly some period of stagflation. That alone would result in a slowdown in the growth in the demand for commodities. But add to that, China. We've just seen the latest figures coming out of China for last year, indicating the lowest and slowest growth rate in, I think, 3 decades. And we know that China has become, if not the biggest, one of the biggest consumers of minerals. So that to fuel their own manufacturing sector. So with that slowdown, I think that will also reduce the interest in commodities. So we might be seeing a double whammy, unfortunately. The demand for minerals and other resources slowing down, and perhaps in some cases like South Africa, over and above that, the production coming under pressure.
All right, Professor, before I let you go, while we're focusing on mining right now, we can't separate mining from the parts of South Africa's economy that it takes, and also as well the larger economy at play, which is all suffering from the Eskom challenge. So I need to ask you about that. As you said, blackouts have hit 12 hours a day now, but there could be some light at the end of the tunnel. So South Africa is developing a new law to speed up energy projects and also increase power capacity. So do you think if these laws or these policies, if they're passed and implemented correctly, could start to bring some relief to the economy and, with my pun intended, lighten things up? Where do you think all of this will go? It's still very early in 2023, but Eskom is really what's going to determine the progress of the South African economy this year.
Yeah. Well, let me first of all make a disclaimer, and that is I've often been accused of being a possibly naive optimist. So to answer your question in 2 ways, do I think that the situation will get better? Yes. Do I think it'll get better in the next few months? No. Next few years, even that might be pushing it. You know, this problem is built up over many, many years. There are structural problems. There are legacy problems. And you cannot undo all these problems overnight. That's simply not feasible. So yes, I think we will start seeing an improvement, but it's going to take a lot more pain and suffering, I believe, before we can say we're totally out of the woods. Best case scenario, maybe in 18 months, we'll start seeing some meaningful alleviation. But up until then, I think we're going to see this volatile load shedding. Sometimes as bad as stage 6, as we call it, sometimes a bit better, maybe only stage 3. But I think it's become part of our reality for the next couple of years.
So just to follow up on that, do you think the policies, the law, speeding up energy projects, increasing power capacity, are those the right way to go for South Africa right now at least?
I think it's part of the solution, yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Do I believe that those things alone will solve the problem? No, I don't think so. But certainly part of the solution. You see, another complicating factor is there is obviously, as we know, a global demand insistence that countries should become more green. That adds to the complications. That's expensive. And a country like South Africa, where we have lots of coal, it's very seductive to use coal-based electricity, but it's very dirty. So we have to we have to bear that in mind as well. The whole nuclear debate, renewables, solar, wind, etc. All of these are going to be part of the energy mix.
All right, Professor Andre Roux, thank you as always for your time. We look forward to talking to you again. Hopefully, as you said, maybe being too optimistic, we may not see that decline continue, but we want to see what happens with Africa's most industrialized economy this coming year. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Goodbye.
And 10 straight months of consecutive decline in mining production, which is a sector that used to be the bedrock and cornerstone of South Africa's economy, is something that many people, policymakers and those in government, need to take very, very closely and make sure that they're paying attention to. Over 420 billion rand that came in from the industry in 2021, with jobs numbering about 458,000, that's direct. Imagine what the indirect implications of a decline and continued issues in the mining sector could spell for South Africa. We'll keep our eyes very closely on that situation.